ఏసీ అద్దెన సరే ఏసీ పోతాండే అద్దెన సరే
అవునమ్మా. తీసేదా
ఐదు వెళ్ళకుండా మళ్ళీ
పట్టుకోండి అమ్మా.
అదే చూసేస్తే సరే అదెందుకు పోయిద్దామా అని పడుతుంది నేను 5 గంటలు లేచినాను అప్పుడు వచ్చున్నాడు లోపల పెడతా అన్నట్టు సామాను వాళ్ళ ఆయన వచ్చినాడు వాళ్ళు ఏమో రారు వస్తే ఐదుకు నేను 5 వేసిన అప్పుడు ఇది బండి సౌండ్ వచ్చింది బండి సౌండ్ వస్తాం కారు ఉంటుంది అయితే చూస్తే లైట్ వేసి ఉండదు వాడు ఉండాలో సామాన్ తీసి పెడతా అన్నారు చాలా సరదా ఉందిగా వీడుకుంటాడు అమ్మాయి భరించడానికి ఏ ఊరు చాలా దూరమా
వస్తుంది. వాళ్ళ కాలేజ్ ఉన్నింది చూడు, దానికి పక్కనే. అవును, దానికి సెంటర్. అవును, దానికి ఆ ఊరికి ఈ ఊరికి సెంటర్లో ఒక గుట్టలు ఉంటాయి అంతే. ఒక ఎత్తైన కొండలు ఉంటాయి. అవును, అది నామక్కల్ జిల్లా. వేరే అదే నామక్కల్. అనుకుందా ఉంటుంది.
రేపు పడతారేమో వీళ్ళంతా కూడా పోతారండి.
అవును.
కత్తెరకాయలు ఆడేముందో సొమ్ము ఏదైనా పెద్ద ఇవి ఉన్నాయా ఆడేమో సొమ్ము కూడా పోతారంటే
అద్దా నేను చెప్పినాను ఆ కొండలు, ఆ కొండలు చూసేదానికి పోతారు. తిరుపతి కొండలు అంత ఎత్తు ఉంటాయి, హైట్.
దానిలో బస్సు పోతుంది.
బస్సు బస్సు పోతుంది. వీళ్ళు ఆడపోయి కారు పెట్టుకోపోతారంట.
ఉహు. కారు తీసుకొని
ఉమ్,
చూస్తారు.
చూస్తారు.
ఆ ఊరే చుట్టుకుంటూ వచ్చేస్తారు.
ఆ ఎగ్జామ్ రాసిన తర్వాత ఆయనకి బయలుదేరుతారు.
ఆ, చుట్టి చూసేసి
చూసేసి వస్తారు.
వచ్చేస్తారు. 4 దినాలు పడితే
4 దినాలు అవుతుంది. పైన చుట్టేదానికి 1 రోజు 2 రోజులు చాలు. ఒక రోజుతో చుట్టుపోతారు పైన.
కానీ ఏరే ఊరికి పోబలే
వేరే ఊర్లు కూడా పోతారేమో పక్కన పక్కన.
ఇలా నువ్వు టికెట్స్ బుక్ చేసినావు కదా, నీకు తెలుసు కదా అని నేను చెప్పాను.
టికెట్లు ఒక చోటికి వాళ్ళు ఎక్కడ కారు ఎత్తుతారో అక్కడి వరకు టికెట్లు బుక్ చేసిండేది.
ఆ కారు ఆడ తిరుగుతుంది ఇంకా.
ఆడదా తిప్పి తీసుకొని వచ్చి ఆ కారు పెట్టేయాలి కదా, అంతవరకు.
నమ్మకాలు చూసి కదా. ఇప్పుడు పిన్ని నెలలు పూసినావా? నెలలు వేసుకున్నావు?
లేదు, కానీ లేసుకున్నా. ఆడ కొంచెం ఉక్కు అయిపోయింది, అందువల్ల లేసుకున్నా. ఉక్క పట్టేసింది వాడ
అవును.
ఒక్కసారి. ఇది వానాకాలం అయిపోయింది అది, అందువల్ల ఇప్పుడు ఉక్కు ఎక్కువైపోతూ ఉంది.
ఏమైపోయింది?
వానాకాలం మేఘాలు వచ్చేది, మూసుకొని ఉండేది, రాత్రి అంతా అట మరి ఉంటా ఉంది కాబట్టి చల్లంగా ఉండింది. ఇప్పుడు 1 నెలగా అటదనే ఉండింది చల్లంగా. మనకి హాయిగా తెల్లారలేసి నేను బెడ్షీట్ అంతా కప్పుకుంటా ఉన్నానే. కిటికీలు వేసేసి తలుపేసేసి మొత్తం రూమ్. అవును, మొత్తం రూమ్ మూసేసి ఉంటే కూడా చలి పెడతా ఉండింది. నేను ఇది కప్పుకుంటా ఉంటున్నా, బెడ్షీట్. ఇప్పుడు 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 అట్టా మరిగా ఆడుంటుంది, ఒక్కదానే పెడతా ఉంది. ఒక పెట్టేది స్టార్ట్ అయిపోయింది కాబట్టి Hunter on Ganges. Of all great rivers on the surface of the globe, none can compare in sanctity with the Ganges, or Mother Ganga, as she is affectionately called by devout Hindus. From her source in the Himalayas to her mouth in the Bay of Bengal, her banks are holy ground. Each point of junction of her main stream with a tributary has special claims to sanctity. But the tongue of land where the Ganges unites with her great sister, river the Jamna, is the true Prayag, the place of pilgrimage to which hundreds of thousands of devout Hindus repair to wish away their sins in her sanctifying waters. Many of the other holy rivers of India borrow their sanctity from a supposititious underground connection with the Ganges. The ancient legend relates how Ganga, the fair daughter of King Himalaya, or Himavat, and of his queen, the air nymph Menaka, was persuaded, after long supplication, to shed her purifying influence upon the sinful earth. The icicle studded cavern from which she issues is the tangled hair of the god Siva. Loving legends Loving legends hallow each part of her course, and from the names of her tributaries and of the towns along her banks, a whole mythology might be built up. Her estuary is not less sacred than her source. Sagar Island at her mouth is annually visited by a vast concourse of pilgrims in commemoration of her act of saving grace when, in order to cleanse the 60,000 damned ones of the house of Sagar, she divides herself into 100 channels, thus making sure of reaching their remains and so forming the delta of Bengal. The 6 years pilgrimage from the source to the mouth and back again, known as Pradakshina, is still performed by many, and a few devotees may yet be seen wearily accomplishing the meritorious penance of measuring their length along certain parts of the route. To bathe in the Ganges at the great stated festivals washes away guilt, and those who have thus purified themselves carry back bottles to their less fortunate kindred in far off provinces. To die and be buried on the river bank is the last wish of millions of Hindus. Even to exclaim Ganga, Ganga at the distance of 100 leagues from the river, say her more enthusiastic devotees, may atone for the sins committed during 3 previous lives. The Ganges has earned the reverence of the people by centuries of unfailing work done for them. She and her tributaries are the unwearied water carriers for the densely peopled provinces of northern India, and the peasantry reverence the bountiful stream which fertilizes their fields and distributes their produce. None of the other rivers of India comes near to the Ganges in works of beneficence. The Brahmaputra and the Indus may have longer streams, as measured by the geographer, but the upper courses of both lie beyond the great mountain wall in the unknown recesses of the Himalayas. Not one of the rivers of southern India is navigable in the proper sense of the word. The Ganges begins to distribute fertility by irrigation as soon as she reaches the plains within 200 miles of her source, and at the same time, her channel becomes in some sort navigable. Thenceforward, she rolls majestically down to the sea in a bountiful stream, which never becomes a merely destructive torrent in the rains and never dwindles away in the hottest summer. Tapped by canals, she distributes millions of cubic feet of water every hour in irrigation, but her diminished volume is promptly recruited by great tributaries, and the wide area of her catchment basin renders her stream inexhaustible in the service of man. Embankments are in but few places required to restrain her inundations, for the alluvial silt which she spills over her banks affords in most parts a top dressing of inexhaustible fertility. If one crop be drowned by the flood, the peasant comforts himself with the thought that his second crop will abundantly requite him. The function of the Ganges as a land maker on a great scale will be alluded to hereafter. The Ganges has also played a preeminent part in the commercial development of northern India. Until the opening up of the railway system within the past 20 years, her magnificent stream formed almost the sole channel of traffic between Upper India and the seaboard. The products not only of the river plains, but even the cotton of the central provinces were formerly brought by this route to Calcutta. Notwithstanding the revolution caused by the railways, the heavier and more bulky staples of the country are still conveyed by the river, and the Ganges may yet rank as one of the greatest waterways in the world. The through traffic into Calcutta alone by the Gangetic channels was valued in 1877-78 at 14 million pounds sterling. At Bhamangata, on one of the canals near Calcutta, 1,78,627 cargo boats were registered in 1876-77. At Hooghly, 1,24,357. And at Patna, 550 miles from the mouth of the river, the number of cargo boats entered into the register was 61,571. Articles of European commerce, such as wheat, indigo, cotton, opium, and saltpeter, prefer the railway. So also do the imports of Manchester piece goods. But if we take into account the vast development in the export trade of oil seeds, rice, etc., still carried by the river, and the growing interchange of food grains between the various parts of the country, it seems probable that the actual amount of traffic on the Ganges in native craft has increased rather than diminished since the opening of the railways. At well chosen points along her course, the iron lines touch her banks, and these riverside stations form centers for collecting and distributing the produce of the surrounding country. The Ganges, therefore, is not merely a rival but a feeder of the railway. Her ancient cities such as Allahabad, Benares, and Patna have thus been able to preserve their former importance, while fishing villages like Sahibganj and Golanda have by the same means been raised into thriving river bars. For unlike the Indus and the Brahmaputra, the Ganges is a river of great historic cities. Calcutta, Patna, and Benares are built on her banks. Agra and Delhi on those of her tributary, the Jamna, and Allahabad on the tongue of land where the two sister streams unite. Many millions of human beings live by commerce along her margin. Calcutta, with its suburbs, contains a population of 7,94,645, according to the census of 1876. It has a municipal revenue of 2,89,844 pounds in 1876-77 and a seaborne commerce of over 50 million pounds sterling, with a landward trade also aggregating close on 50 million pounds sterling. This great city lies on the Hooghly, the most westerly of the mouths by which the Ganges enters the sea. To the eastwards stretches the delta till it is hemmed in on the other side by the Meghna, the most easterly of the mouths of the Ganges, or rather, the united estuary by which the combined waters of the Brahmaputra and Gangetic river systems find their way into the Bay of Bengal. In order, therefore, to understand the plains of northern India, we must have a clear idea of the part played by the great rivers. For the rivers first create the land, then fertilize it, and finally distribute its produce. The plains of Bengal were in many parts upheaved by volcanic forces or deposited in an aqueous era before the present race of man appeared. But in other parts, they have been formed out of the silt which the rivers bring down from the mountains. And at this day, we may stand by and watch the ancient silent process of land making going on. A great Indian river like the Ganges has three distinct stages in its career from the Himalayas to the sea. In the first stage of its course, it dashes down the Himalayas, cutting out for itself deep gullies in the solid rock and ploughing up glens between the mountains. In wading across the Sutlej feeders among the fields in the rainy season, my ankles have been sore from the pebbles which the stream carried with it, while even in the hot weather, the rushing sand and gravel cause a prickly sensation across the feet. The second stage in the life of a river begins at the point where it emerges from the mountains upon the plains. It then runs more peacefully along the valleys, searching out for itself the lowest levels. It receives the drainage and mud of the country on both sides, absorbs tributaries, and rolls forward with an ever increasing volume of water and silt. Every torrent from the Himalayas brings its separate contribution, which it has torn from the rocks or eroded from its banks. This process repeats itself throughout many thousands of miles. That is to say, down the course of each tributary from the Himalayas and across the northern plains of India. As long as the force of the current is maintained by a sufficient fall per mile, the river carries forward the silt thus supplied and adds to it fresh contributions from its banks. Each river acquires a character of its own as it advances, a character which tells the story of its early life. Thus, the Indus is loaded with silt of a brown hue. The Chenab has a reddish tinge, while the Sutlej is of a paler color. The exact amount of fall required per mile depends upon the specific gravity of the silt which it carries. At a comparatively early stage, the current drops the heavy particles of rock or sand which it has torn from the Himalayan precipices. But a fall of 5 inches per mile suffices to hold in suspension the great body of the silt and to add further accretions in passing through alluvial plains. The average fall of the Ganges between Benares and the delta head, about 461 miles, is nearly 5 inches per mile. By the time the Ganges reaches the middle of the lower Bengal, Kolgong to Calcutta, its average fall per mile has dropped to 4 inches. From Calcutta to the sea, it varies according to the tide from 1 to 2 inches. The current is no longer strong enough to carry the burden of its silt and accordingly deposits it. In lower Bengal, therefore, the Ganges enters on the third stage of its life, finding its speed checked by the equal level of the plains and its bed raised by the deposits of its own silt. It splits out into channels like a jet of water suddenly obstructed by the finger or a jar of liquid dashed on the floor. Each of the new streams has created, throws out and turn its own set of channels to left and right. The country which their many offshoots enclose and intersect forms the delta of Bengal. The present delta of the Ganges may be taken to commence at a point 1,231 miles from its source and 326 from the sea by its longest channel. At that point, the headwaters of the Hooghly break off under the name of the Bhagirathi from the main channel and make their way almost due south to the sea. The main volume pursues its course to the southeast, and a great triangle of land with its southern base on the Bay of Bengal is thus enclosed. Between the Hooghly on the west and the main channel on the east, a succession of offshoots strikes southward from the Ganges. The network of streams struggles slowly downwards over the level delta. Their currents are no longer able, by reason of their diminished speed, to carry along the silt or sand which the more rapid parent river has brought down from northern India. They accordingly drop their burden of silt in their channels or along their margins, producing almond shaped islands, and by degrees raising their banks and channels above the surrounding plains. When they spill over their banks, the largest amount of silt is deposited in the vicinity of their margin. In this way, not only their beds, but also the land along their banks is gradually raised. Now he has given the section of a deltaic channel of the Ganges. The rivers of a delta thus build themselves up, as it were, into high level canals, which in the rainy season overflow their banks and leave their silt upon the low country on either side. Thousands of square miles in lower Bengal receive in this way each summer a top dressing of new soil, bought free of cost for more than 1,000 miles by the river currents from northern India or the still more distant Himalayas. A system of natural manuring which yields a constant succession of rich crops. At Golanda, about halfway between the delta head and the sea, the Ganges unites with the main stream of the Brahmaputra and farther down with the Meghna. Their combined waters exhibit deltaic operations on the most gigantic scale. They represent the drainage collected by the two vast river systems of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra from an aggregate catchment basin of 7,52,000 square miles on both sides of the Himalayas, together with the rainfall poured into the Meghna from the Burmese watershed. The forces thus brought into play are beyond the calculations even of modern engineering. As the vast network of rivers creeps farther down the delta, they become more and more sluggish and raise their beds still higher above the adjacent flats. Each set of channels has a depressed tract or swamp on either side, so that the lowest levels in a delta lie about halfway between the rivers. The stream constantly overflows into these depressed tracts and gradually fills them up with its silt. The water which rushes from the river into the swamps has sometimes the color of pea soup from the quantity of silt which it carries. When it has stood a few days in the swamps and the river flood subsides, the the water flows back from the swamps into the river channel, but it has dropped all its silt and is of a clear dark brown hue. The silt remains in the swamp and by degrees fills it up, thus slowly creating new land. The muddy foliage of the trees which have been submerged bears witness to the fresh deposit. As we shall presently see, buried roots and decayed stumps are found at great depths, while nearer the top, the excavator comes upon the remains of old tanks, broken pottery, and other traces of human habitations, which within historic times were above the ground. The last scene in the life of an Indian river is a wilderness of forest and swamp at the end of the delta, amid whose malarious solitude the network of tidal creeks merges into the sea. Here, all the secrets of land making stand disclosed. The river channels, finally checked by the dead weight of the sea, deposit most of their remaining silt, which emerges in the shape of banks or blunted headlands. The ocean currents also find themselves impeded by the outflow from the rivers, and in their turn drop the burden of sand which they sweep along the coast. The two causes combine to build up breakwaters of mingled sand and mud upon the foreshore. In this way, while the solid earth gradually grows outward into the sea, owing to the deposits of river silt, peninsulas and islands are formed along the river mouths from the sand dropped by the ocean currents, and a double process of land making goes on. The great Indian rivers, therefore, not only supply new ground by depositing chars or islands in their beds and by filling up the low lying tracts or swamps beyond their margins, but also by forming banks and capes and masses of land at their mouths. They slowly construct their deltas by driving back the sea. Egypt was the gift of the Nile, according to her priests in the age of Herodotus. And the vast province of Lower Bengal is, in the strictest scientific sense, the gift of the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the eastern waters of the Meghna. The deltas of these three river systems are now united into one, but three distinct delta heads are observable. The delta head of the Brahmaputra commences near the bend where the river now twists due south round the Garo Hills, 220 miles from the sea as the crow flies. And the present delta head of the Ganges begins at the point where the Bhagirathi breaks southward from the main channel, also about 220 miles in a direct line from the sea. The delta of the Meghna, which represents the heavy southern rainfall of the Khasi Hills and the western drainage of the great watershed between Bengal and independent Burma, commences in Sylhet district. The three deltas, instead of each forming a triangle like the Greek letter delta, unite to form an irregular parallelogram running inland 220 miles from the coast with an average breadth also of about 220 miles. This vast alluvial basin of say 50,000 square miles was once covered with the deep sea, and it has been slowly filled up to the height of at least 400 feet by the deposits which the rivers have brought down. In other words, the united river systems of the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna have torn away from the Himalayas and northeastern Bengal enough earth to build up a lofty island with an area of 50,000 square miles and a height of 400 feet. I have been careful not to overstate the work performed by the rivers. Borings have been carried down to 481 feet at Calcutta, but the auger broke at the depth, and it is impossible to say how much farther the alluvial deposits may go. There seem to have been successive eras of vegetation, followed by repeated depressions of the surface. These successive eras of vegetation now form layers of stumps of trees, peat beds, and carbonized wood. Passing below traces of recently submerged forests, a well marked peat bed is found in all excavations around Calcutta at a depth varying from 20 to 30 feet, and decayed wood with pieces of fine coal, such as occur in mountain streams, was met with at a depth of 392 feet. Fossilized remains of animal life have been brought up from 372 feet below the present surface. The subjoined footnote illustrates the successive layers of the vast island, so to speak, which the rivers have built up. It should be remembered that they have been aided in their work by the sand deposited by the ocean currents. But on the other hand, the alluvial deposits of the Ganges and Brahmaputra commence far to the north of the present delta head and have a total area greatly exceeding the 50,000 square miles mentioned in the last paragraph. The Brahmaputra has covered over with thick alluvium the valley of Assam. Its confluent, the Meghna, or rather the upper waters, which ultimately form the Meghna, have done the same fertilizing task for the valleys of Kachar and Sylhet, while the Ganges, with its mighty feeders, has prepared for the uses of man thousands of square miles of land in the broad hollow between the Himalayas and the Vindhyas, far to the west of its present delta. A large quantity of the finest and lightest silt, moreover, is carried out to sea and discolors the Bay of Bengal 150 miles from the shore. The plains of Bengal are truly the gift of the great rivers. Several attempts have been made to estimate the time which the Ganges and Brahmaputra must have required for accomplishing their gigantic task. The borings already referred to, together with an admirable account by Colonel Baird Smith in the Calcutta Journal of Natural History and the Reverend Mr. Everest's calculations, form the chief materials for such an estimate. Sir Charles Lyell accepts Mr. Everest's calculation made half a century ago that the Ganges discharges 6,368 millions of cubic feet of silt per annum. Sorry. This would alone suffice to supply 355 millions of tons a year, or nearly the weight of 60 replicas of the Great Pyramid. It is scarcely possible, he says, to present any picture to the mind which will convey an adequate conception of the mighty scale of this operation, so tranquilly and almost insensibly carried on by the Ganges. About 96% of the whole amount are brought down during the 4 months of the rainy season. The work thus done in that season may be realized if we suppose that a fleet of 2,000 great ships sailed down the river every day during the 4 months and deposited a freight of 1,400 tons of mud apiece each morning into the estuary. But the Ganges at Ghazipur is only a single feeder of the mighty mass of waters which have formed the delta of Bengal. The Ganges, after leaving Ghazipur, receives many of its principal tributaries such as the Gogra, the San, the Gandak, and the Kusi. It then unites with the Brahmaputra and finally with the Meghna, and the total mass of mud brought down by these combined river systems is estimated by Sir Charles Lyell to be at least 6 or 7 times as much as that discharged by the Ganges alone at Ghazipur. We have therefore, at the lowest estimate, about 40 million, sorry, 40,000 millions of cubic feet of solid matter spread over the delta or deposited at the river mouths or carried out to sea each year. According to Sir Charles Lyell, 5 times as much as is conveyed by the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. The silt borne along during the rainy season alone represents the work which a fleet of 13,000 ships sailing down the Ganges each day of the 4 rainy months would perform by discharging a freight of 1,400 tons apiece each morning into the Bay of Bengal. General Richard Strachey took the area of the delta and coastline within influence of the deposits at 65,000 square miles and estimated that the rivers would require 45.3 years to raise it by 1 foot, even by their enormous deposit of 40,000 millions of cubic feet of solid earth per annum. The rivers must have been at work 13,600 years in building up the delta 300 feet. But borings have brought up fluvial deposits from a depth of at least 400 feet. The present delta forms, moreover, but a very small part of the vast alluvial area which the rivers have constructed in the great dip between the Himalayas and the Vindhyan mountains. The more closely we scrutinize the various elements in such estimates, the more vividly do we realize ourselves in the presence of an almost immeasurable labor carried on during an almost immeasurable past. The land which the great Indian rivers thus create, they also fertilize. In the lower parts of their course, we have seen how their overflow affords a natural system of irrigation and manuring. In the higher parts, man has to step in and to bring their water by canals to his fields. Some idea of the enormous irrigation enterprises of northern India will be found in the four articles on the Ganges and Jamna canals. The Ganges Canal had, in 1875, a length of 519 miles and 3,386 miles of distributaries, with an irrigated area of 8,89,167 acres, including both Rabi and Kharif harvests, and a revenue of 2,89,925 pounds on a total outlay of 2 and 3 quarters of a million sterling. The lower Ganges Canal will bring under irrigation nearly 1.25 million acres, including both Rabi and Kharif. The eastern Jamna Canal had, in 1875, a length of 130 miles, with 618 miles of main distributaries. The western Jamna Canal measures 405 miles, with an aggregate of 259 miles of distributing channels, besides private water courses. The two irrigate together over half a million of acres. The Indian rivers form, moreover, the great highways of the country. They supply cheap transit for the collection, distribution, and export of the agricultural staples. What the arteries are to the living body, the rivers are to the plains of Bengal. But the very vastness of their energy sometimes causes terrible calamities. Scarcely a year passes without floods, which sweep off cattle and grain stores and the thatched cottages, with anxious families perched on their roofs. In the upper part of their courses, where their water is carried by canals to the fields, the rich irrigated lands breed fever and are in places rendered sterile by a saline crust called ray. Farther down, the uncontrollable rivers wriggle across the face of the country, deserting their old beds and searching out new channels for themselves. It may be at a distance of many miles. Their old banks, clothed with trees and dotted along their route with villages, run like high ridges through the revel rice fields and mark the deserted course of the river. I have mentioned how the Brahmaputra has deserted its main channel of the last century and now rushes to the sea by a new course far to the westwards. Such changes are on so vast a scale, and the eroding power of the current is so irresistible that it is perilous to build any structure of a large or permanent character on the margin. The ancient sacred bed of the Ganges through the districts of Hooghly and the 24 Parganas is now marked only by a succession of tanks, temples, and muddy pools. Many decayed or ruined cities attest the alterations in riverbeds within historic times. In our own days, the Ganges passed close under Raj Mahal, and that town, once the Mohammedan capital of Bengal, was selected as the spot where the railway should tap the river system. The Ganges has now turned away in a different direction and left the town high and dry, 7 miles from the bank. In 1787-88, the Teesta, a great river of northern Bengal, broke away from its ancient bed. The Atroy, our main channel, by which its waters found their way into the Ganges, has now dwindled into a stream which, in the dry weather, just suffices for boats of 2 tons burden, while the Tista has branched to the eastwards and pours into the Brahmaputra. In 1870, the Ravi, one of the 5 rivers of the Punjab, carried away the famous shrine of the Sheikhs near Dena Nanak and still threatens the town. If we go back to a more remote period, we find that the whole ancient geography of India is obscured by changes in the courses of the rivers. Thus, Hastinapur, the city of the Pandavas in the Mahabharata, is with difficulty identified in a dried up bend of the Ganges, 57 miles northeast of the present Delhi. The once splendid capital of Kanauj, which also lay upon the Ganges, now moulders in desolation, 4 miles away from the modern river bank. The remnant of its inhabitants live for the most part in huts built up against the ancient walls. A similar fate on a small scale has befallen Kushtia, the river terminus of the Eastern Bengal Railway. The channel silted up between 1860 to 70, and the terminus had to be removed to Goalanda farther down the river. My account of the Hughley records many emporiums and river capitals ruined from the same cause and exhibits the vast engineering efforts which are required to secure the permanence of Calcutta as a great port. An idea of the forces at work may be derived from a single well known phenomenon of the Hooghly and the Meghna, the Bore, the or the bore. I don't know what he is meant. The tide advances up their broad estuaries until checked by a rapid contraction of the channel. The obstructed influx, no longer able to spread itself out, rises into a wall of waters from 5 to 30 feet in height, which rushes onwards at a rate nearly double that of a stagecoach. Rennell stated that the Hooghly bore ran from Hooghly Point to Hooghly Town, a distance of about 70 miles, in 4 hours. The native boatmen fly for the bank when they hear it coming. The river, which a few minutes before was covered with craft, is left bare and deserted before its approach. The bore of the Meghna is so terrific and dangerous that no boat will venture down certain of the channels at spring tide. The Indian rivers not only desert the cities on their banks, but they sometimes tear them away. Many a hamlet and rice field and ancient grove of trees is remorselessly eaten up each autumn by the current. A Bengal proprietor has sometimes to look on helplessly while his estate is being swept away or converted into the bed of a broad, deep river. An important branch of Indian legislation has been developed to deal with the proprietary changes thus caused by alluvion and diluvion. The rivers have a tendency to straighten themselves out. Their course consists of a series of bends in each of which the current sets against one bank, which it undermines, while it leaves still water on the other bank, in which new deposits of land take place. By degrees, these twists become sharper and sharper until the intervening land is almost worn away, leaving only a narrow tongue between the bends. The river finally bursts through the slender solid strip, or a canal is cut through it by human agency, and direct communication is thus established between points formerly many miles distant by the windings of the river. This process of eating away soil from the one bank against which the current sets and depositing silt in the still water along the other is constantly at work. Even in their quietest moods, therefore, the rivers steadily steal land from the old owners and give it capriciously to a fresh set. During the rains, these forces work with uncontrollable fury. We have just seen how the first terminus of the Eastern Bengal Railway at Kushtia had been partially deserted by the Ganges. Its new terminus at Govalanda has suffered from an opposite but equally disastrous accident. Up to 1875, the Goalanda station stood upon a massive embankment near the water's edge, protected by masonry spurs running out to the river. About 1,30,000 pounds had been spent upon these protective works, and it was hoped that engineering skill had conquered the violence of the Gangetic floods. But in August 1875, the solid masonry spurs, the railway station, and the magistrates' court were all swept away, and deep water covered their site. A new terminus had to be erected about 2 miles from the river bank. Indeed, each autumn the mighty currents undermine and then rend away many thousand acres of solid land. They afterwards deposit their spoil in their channels farther down, and thus, as we have seen, leave high and dry in ruin many an ancient city on their banks. Their work, however, is on the whole beneficent, and a poem of of Ocean might be made out of the names which the Indian peasant applies to his beloved rivers. Thus, we have the goddess of flowing speech, or Saraswati, or according to another derivation, the river of pools. The streak of gold or Swarnarekha, the glancing waters are Chitra, the dark channel are Kala Nadi, the sinless one are Papagni or Papahini, the arrowy are Sharavati, the golden sands Suvarnamati, the stream at which the deer drinks Haringhata, the forest hope Banas, the old twister Burabalang, besides more common names such as the All Destroyer, the Forest King, the Lord of Strength, the Silver Waters, and the Flooder. Throughout the river plains of northern India, two harvests and in some provinces three are reaped each year. These crops are not necessarily taken from the same land, but in many districts the best fields have to yield two harvests within the 12 months. In lower Bengal, peas, pulses, oil seeds, and green crops of various sorts are reaped in spring. The early rice crops in September, the great rice harvest of the year, and other grains in November and December. Before these last have been gathered in, it is time to prepare the ground for the spring crops, and the husbandman knows no rest except during the hot weeks of May when he is anxiously waiting for the rains. Such is the course of agriculture in Lower Bengal. But should but it should always be remembered that rice is the staple crop in a limited area of India and that it forms the everyday food of only 67 millions or one third of the population. It has been estimated that in the absence of irrigation, the rice crop requires an annual rainfall of at least 36 inches, and an Indian province requires an average fall of not less than 40 to 60 inches in order to grow rice as its staple crop. A line might almost be drawn across Bihar, to the north of which the food of the people ceases to be rice and becomes wheat and millets, etc. There are indeed rice growing tracts in favored low lying districts of northern India and in the river valleys or deltas and level strips around the southern coast. But in upper India, their produce is consumed only by the richer classes. The chief products of each province are carefully enumerated in the separate provincial treatises, notices in the imperial gazetteer, and an account of the most important will be found under the heading of agriculture farther on in the present volume. I here allude to them only so far as is necessary to give a general idea of the scenery of the river plains. In the northern and drier regions along the upper courses of the rivers, the country rises gently from their banks in fertile undulations, dotted with mud villages and adorned with noble trees. Mango groves scent the air with their blossom in spring and yield their abundant fruit in summer. The spreading banyan with its colonnades of hanging roots, the stately peepal with its green masses of foliage, the leafless wild cotton tree glowing with heavy crimson flowers, the tall delicate tamarind and the quick growing babul rear their heads above the crop fields. As the rivers approach the coast, the palm trees take possession of the scene. The ordinary landscape in the delta is a flat stretch of rice fields, fringed round with an evergreen border of bamboos, coconuts, date trees, areca, and other coroneted palms. This densely peopled tract seems at first sight bare of villages, for each hamlet is hidden away amidst its own grove of plantains and wealth giving trees. The bamboo and coconut play a conspicuous part in the industrial life of the people, and the numerous products derived from them, including rope, oil, food, and timber, have been dwelt on with admiration by many writers. The crops also change as we sail down the river. In the north, the principal grains are wheat, barley, Indian corn, and a variety of millets such as jowar, holcus sorghum, and bajra, holcus picatus. In the delta, on the other hand, rice is the staple crop and the universal diet. In a single district, Rangpur, I have named the 295 separate kinds of rice known to the peasant who has learned to grow his favorite crop in every locality, from the solid field which yields the almond harvest to the swamps 12 feet deep on the surface of whose waters the rice ears may be seen struggling upwards for air. Sugarcane, oilseeds, flax, mustard, sesamum, palmachiste, cotton, tobacco, indigo, safflower, and other dyes Ginger, coriander, capsicum, cumin, and precious spices are grown both in the northwestern or upper provinces and in the moister valleys and delta of lower Bengal. The whole pharmacopoeia of native medicines, from the well known aloe and castor oil to obscure but valuable febrifuges, is derived from shrubs, herbs, and roots. Resins, gums, varnishes, India rubber, perfume oils, and 100 articles of commerce or luxury are obtained from the fields and the forests. Vegetables, both indigenous and imported from Europe, largely enter into the food of the people. The melon and huge yellow pumpkin spread themselves over the thatched roofs. Fields of potato, brinjal, and yams are attached to the homesteads. The tea plant is reared on the hilly ranges that skirt the plains, both in the northwest and in Assam. The opium poppy, about halfway down the Ganges, around Benares and in Bihar. The silkworm mulberry, still farther down in lower Bengal. While the jute fiber is essentially a crop of the delta and would exhaust any soil not fertilized by river floods. Even the jungles yield the costly lac and the tassar silk cocoons. The mahua, also a gift of the jungle, produces the fleshy flowers which form a staple article of food among the hill tribes and, when distilled, supply a cheap spirit. The sal, sisu, thun, and many other indigenous trees yield excellent timber. Flowering creepers of gigantic size and gorgeous colors festoon the jungle, while each tank bears its own beautiful crop of the lotus and water lily. Nearly every vegetable product which feeds and clothes a people or enables it to trade with foreign countries abounds. Having described the leading features of the Himalayas on the north and of the great river plains at their base, I come now to the third division of India, namely the three sided tableland, which covers the southern half or more strictly peninsular portion of India. This tract, known in ancient times as the Deccan or Dakshin, literally the south, comprises the central provinces Berar, Madras, Bombay, Mysore, with the native territories of the Nizam, Sindhia, Holkar, and other feudatory states. It had in 1872 an aggregate population of over 90 millions. For the sake of easy remembrance, therefore, we may take the inhabitants of the river plains in the north at nearly 150 millions and the inhabitants of the southern three sided tableland at nearly 100 millions. The Deccan, in its local acceptation, is restricted to the high tract between the Narbada or Nerbada and the Krishna rivers, but it is popularly understood to include the whole country south of the Vindhyas as far as Cape Comorin. It slopes up from the southern edge of the Gangetic Plains. Three ranges of hills support its northern, its eastern, and its western side, the two latter meeting at a sharp angle near Cape Comorin. The northern side rests on confused ranges running with a general direction of east to west and known in the aggregate as the Vindhya Mountains. The Vindhyas, however, are made up of several distinct hill systems. Two sacred peaks stand as outposts in the extreme east and west, with a succession of ranges stretching 800 miles between. At the western extremity, Mount Abu, famous for its exquisite Jain temples, rises as a solitary outlier of the Aravalli Hills, 5,650 feet above the Rajputana plains, like an island out of the sea. Beyond the southern limits of that plain, the Vindhya range of modern geography runs almost due east from Gujarat, forming the northern wall of the Narbada Valley. The Satpura Mountains stretch along east and west to the south of that river and form the watershed between it and the Tapti. Towards the heart of India, the eastern extremities of these two ranges end in the highlands of the central provinces with their lofty level plains. Passing still farther east, the hill system finds a continuation in the Kaimur range and its congeners, which eventually end in the outlying peaks and spurs that mark the western boundary of Lower Bengal and abut on the old course of the Ganges under the name of the Rajmahal Hills. On the extreme east, Mount Parasnath, like Mount Abu on the extreme west, sacred to Jain rites, rises to 4,400 feet above the level of the Gangetic Plain. The various ranges of the Vindhyas from 1,500 to over 4,000 feet high form, as it were, the northern wall and buttresses which support the central tableland. Now pierced by road and railway, they stood in former times as a barrier of mountain and jungle between northern and southern India and formed one of the main difficulties in building the whole into an empire. They consist of vast masses of forest, ridges, and peaks broken by cultivated valleys and broad, high yielding plains. The other two sides of the elevated southern triangle are known as the Eastern and Western Ghats. These chains start southwards from the eastern and western extremities of the Vindhyas and run along the eastern and western coasts of India. The eastern Ghats stretch in a fragmentary spurs and ranges down the Madras Presidency, receding inland and leaving broad level tracks between their base and the coast. The Western Ghats form the great seawall of the Bombay Presidency, with only a narrow strip between them and the shore. Some of them rise in magnificent precipices and headlands out of the ocean and truly look like colossal passes or landing stairs or ghats from the sea. The eastern ghats have an average elevation of 1,500 feet. The western ghats ascend more abruptly from the sea to an average height of about 3,000 feet, with peaks up to 4,700 along the Bombay coast, rising to 7,000 and even 8,760 feet in the upheaved angle where they unite with the Eastern Ghats towards their southern extremity. The inner triangular plateau, thus enclosed, lies from 1,000 to 3,000 feet above the level of the sea, but it is dotted with peaks and seamed with ranges exceeding 4,000 feet in height. Its best known hills are the Nilgiris or Blue Mountains, with the summer capital of Madras, Uttakamand, 7,000 feet above the sea. Their highest point is Dodabetta Peak, 8,760 feet at the upheaved southern angle. The interior plateau is approached by several famous passes from the level coast strip on the western side. The Borghat, for example, ascends a tremendous ravine about 40 miles southeast of Bombay city to a height of 1,798 feet. In ancient times, it was regarded as the key to the Deccan and could be held by a small band against any army attempting to penetrate from the coast. A celebrated military road was constructed by the British up this pass and practically gave the command of the interior to the then rising port of Bombay. A railway line has now been carried up the gorge, twisting round the shoulders of mountains, tunneling through intervening crags, and clinging along narrow ledges to the face of the precipice. At one point, the zigzag is so sharp as to render a circuitous turn impossible, and the trains have to stop and reverse their direction on a leveled terrace. The Thal Ghat to the northeast of Bombay has in like manner been scaled both by road and railway. Another celebrated pass farther down the coast connects the the military center of Belgaum with the little port of Vingurla. These landing stars from the sea to the interior present scenes of rugged grandeur. The trap rocks stand out after ages of denudation, like circular fortresses flanked by round towers from the mass of hills behind. Natural fastnesses, which in the Maratha times were rendered impregnable by military art. In the south of Bombay, the passes climb up from the sea through thick forests, the haunt of the tiger and the mighty bison. Still farther down the coast, the western mountain wall dips deep into the Palghat Valley, a remarkable gap 20 miles broad and leading by an easy route only 1,000 feet in height from the seaboard to the interior. A third railway and military road start by this passage from Baipur across the peninsula to Madras. On the eastern side of India, the Ghats form a series of spurs and buttresses for the elevated inner plateau rather than a continuous mountain wall. They are traversed by a number of broad and easy passages from the Madras coast. Through these openings, the rainfall of the southern half of the inner plateau reaches the sea. The drainage from the northern or Vindhyan edge of the three sided tableland falls into the Ganges. The Narbada or Nerbada and Tapti carry the rainfall of the southern slopes of the Vindhyas and of the Satpura hills by two almost parallel lines into the Gulf of Cambay. But from Surat in latitude 21 degrees 9 minutes to Cape Comorin in latitude 8 degrees 4 minutes, no great river succeeds in piercing the Western Ghats or in reaching the Bombay coast from the interior tableland. The Western Ghats form, in fact, a lofty, unbroken barrier between the waters of the Central Plateau and the Indian Ocean. The drainage has therefore to make its way across India to the eastwards, now twisting sharply round projecting ranges, then tumbling down ravines or rushing along valleys until the rain which the Bombay sea breeze has dropped upon the Western Ghats finally falls into the Bay of Bengal. In this way, the three great rivers of the Madras Presidency, which the Godavari, the Krishna, and the Kaveri, rise in the mountains overhanging the Bombay coast and traverse the whole breadth of the central tableland before they reach the sea on the eastern shores of India. The physical geography and the political destiny of the two sides of the Indian peninsula have been determined by the characteristics of the mountain ranges on either coast. On the east, the country is comparatively open and was everywhere accessible to the spread of civilization. On the east, therefore, the ancient dynasties of southern India fixed their capitals. Along the west, only a narrow strip of low land intervenes between the barrier range and the seaboard. The inhabitants of those tracts remained apart from the civilization of the eastern coast. To this day, one of their ruling races, the Nairs, retain land tenures and social customs such as polyandry, which mark a much ruder stage of human advancement than Hinduism, and which in other parts of India only linger among isolated hill tribes. On the other hand, the people of the western coast enjoy a bountiful rainfall unknown in the inner plateau and the east. The monsoon dashes its rain laden clouds against the western ghats and pours from 100 to 200 inches of rain upon their maritime slopes from Khandesh down to Malabar. By the time the monsoon has crossed the Western Ghats, it has dropped the greater part of its aqueous burden, and central districts such as Bangalore obtain only about 35 inches. The eastern coast also receives a monsoon of its own, but except in the neighborhood of the sea, the rainfall throughout the Madras Presidency is scanty, seldom exceeding 40 inches in the year. The deltas of the three great rivers along the Madras coast form, however, tracts of inexhaustible fertility, and much is done by irrigation to husband and utilize both the local rainfall and the accumulated waters which the rivers bring down. The ancient Sanskrit poets speak of southern India as buried under forests, and sal, ebony, sisu, teak, and other great trees still abound. The Western Ghats, in particular, are covered with magnificent vegetation wherever a sapling can take root. The mountains of Canara, Malabar, Mysore, and Coorg furnish the forest department with its richest supplies. Along some of their highest ridges grow what is officially known as the evergreen forest. The poon or Calophyllum augustifolium shoots up straight to 100 feet without branch or bend. Few trees in the world are better suited for ships, spars, and masts. The fruit yielding jack or Artocarpus integrifolia, the ironwood Mesua ferrea, the Indian mahogany Cedrela tuna, ebony Diosporus ebenaster, and champak Michelia champaca, teak Tectona grandis, blackwood unsurpassed for carvings Dalbergia latifolia,